finished chapter 5, and chapter 5 is that moment when David now becomes king over all of Israel. He had been king of Judah for some time. This is when he now finally achieves that higher status and is regarded as the king of the whole nation of Israel. And of course, a couple of items of business he had to dispose of right away. One was to establish a capital, and he centered that, of course, in Jerusalem. We talked about that last time. Made Jerusalem the most famous city in the history of the world to this day. You can hardly go a day without hearing of Jerusalem sometime, somewhere in the press. He also had to deal with the Philistines, who were going to try to make quick work of him, getting rid of him before he got any traction. But of course, the result was just the opposite. He was able to push them back into their own territories and thereby reclaim actual rule over a pretty good piece of real estate in Israel that had, at least for a time, been under Philistine control. When Saul died and when the Philistines had succeeded in that battle against him 7 years earlier, they had, of course, occupied that region. Now they're driven back. So that brings us to chapter 6. However, between chapters 5 and 6, I'm going to insert chapter 21. This seemed like a good idea, you know. So 21, if you have read through this whole 2 Samuel book, you know that toward the end of it, we have what some commentators call a kind of appendix. Several little stories that are not necessarily presented in chronological sequence, but are offered more or less as footnotes. And one of those is the story of the aftermath of Saul's campaign against the Gibeonites. It's a tough story. It's tough to teach, it's tough to hear, but here you are, and so we're going to do it. So I'm going to stick this one in right between chapters 5 and 6, and then we'll go ahead and finish through chapter 6 as well, which also is kind of a tough story. It's the story of the death of Uzzah as he was reaching out, trying to steady the ark. So two tough stories. I was hoping no one would come today, but here you are. So, you know, we just, what are we going to do? We have to deal with these. So anyway, the first of them, as I say, is given to us in chapter 21 of 2 Samuel. And so we'll look at this one first. This is 2 Samuel chapter 21, beginning at verse 1, the Word of God. During the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 successive years. So David sought the face of the Lord. The Lord said, "It's on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It's because he put the Gibeonites to death." The king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now, the Gibeonites were not part of Israel, but were survivors of the Amorites. The Israelites had sworn to spare them, but Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, had tried to annihilate them. David asked the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? How shall I make amends so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance?" The Gibeonites answered him, "We have no right to demand silver or gold from Saul or his family, nor do we have a right to put just anyone in Israel to death." "Well, what do you want me to do for you?" David asked. And if you know this story, you know the answer that was given, which is startling. And we'll look at that in just a moment. But let's have a word of prayer as we get started. Our Father, we're grateful for the story of David. We thank you that we see glimpses of ourselves here and there, the problems that he has to wrestle with, the moments of greatness, the moments of weakness. We thank you that in all of it, we can see even more deeply a glimpse of the grace that carried him along, and take great comfort in the fact that that same grace is offered to us. We pray that we might learn something of that as we consider these two texts this morning, asking all of this in the name of Christ. Amen. So, we learned that there was a famine in Israel. As I say, the precise chronology of this incident is not known for certain, but the at least consensus, it seems to be, of commentators who address the question tend to put it earlier in David's reign, when the memory of what Saul had done was still at least somewhat fresh in some people's minds. And so I'm going to put it here, not necessarily because I think it happened at this moment, but probably within the first several years of David's reign over all of Israel, this incident occurred. It was a tough famine. We've, of course, seen images on TV of famine conditions in various parts of the world. It's gut-wrenching to see the faces of little children, and even in the ancient world, the famine conditions would be more severe. They didn't have any kind of food preservation technology such as we take for granted. And so a famine that went on year after year, 3 years, was a serious problem. And David apparently began to suspect that there was more going on here than simply the vagaries of a climate situation, you know. He was beginning to think maybe there was something of a deeper significance. And so, as we've seen before, he inquires of the Hebrew oracle as to just what's up. And he receives this answer. Don't know if he suspected there was something like this out there, but this certainly brought clarity to the issue. He was told it was because of Saul and his bloodthirsty house. Saul had enacted, as we discussed last time we were together briefly, a policy of what amounted to genocide against the Gibeonites. It was still fresh in the memories of people. It, of course, reminds us, and this is really the first little point to take to heart in this, that even though Saul is dead, even though much of his family is dead, even though any heirs to the throne basically are out of the picture, nevertheless, the sins that Saul committed continue to reverberate. That there continues to be a significant impact on succeeding people as a result of what he did. As if to say that sin is never a private affair. That if I do something that I think is private and only affects myself, that I should nevertheless keep in mind that sin always has repercussions. I may not see them immediately, I may not be aware of them, but it is an inescapable fact of the way God has engineered this universe. And so now the crimes of Saul wind up as a problem on the desk of David, and he's the one that's going to have to figure out what to do. Well, given this information, he called the Gibeonites. We mentioned last time we were together that many had been killed, but some had been driven into exile. They were actually forced to live in Philistia, in a city that was called Second Gath, and that's where they were, driven out of the land that had been given to them by treaty and forced to live outside. So now David calls them, probably a representative group of them, to meet and discuss this issue. The Gibeonites were reminded, or not, of the children of Israel. They were part of the aboriginal population, the Canaanites there, among others. They were a remnant of those. The children of Israel had sworn to protect them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. Interesting, of course, Saul could sometimes be underzealous. Sometimes when he had a precise command from God given to him by Samuel, he did less than what he was supposed to do, found a compromise, a way to fall short of the mark, and it was that really wound up depriving him of establishing a dynasty in Israel. You recall that, of course, with the Amalekites. But sometimes Saul could be overzealous, and this is a case in point in which he's going beyond what was warranted, ostensibly because he had zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. He probably quoted this verse to those who served under him as they were commanded to go and exercise this policy of extermination against the Gibeonites. He probably quoted to them what Moses had said back in Deuteronomy, when Moses said, when the Lord your God brings you into the land which you go to possess and has cast out many nations before you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them or show mercy to them. Pretty severe. That was the stated sort of campaign strategy under Joshua. I'm sure that Saul quoted that verse to the men who were serving. Of course, he conveniently skipped over a subsequent statement made in Joshua in which we hear that Joshua made peace with them, that is the Gibeonites, made a covenant with them to let them live, and the rulers of the congregation swore to them to that effect. So it carved out an exception, which Saul seems to have conveniently ignored. We might wonder, why did Saul become so selective in his reading of the scriptures? And the likelihood is that he was not simply motivated by zeal for Israel and Judah, but that he was also motivated to some degree by zeal for Saul. Because what he wanted to do was find some way to reward those who were most loyal to him. We looked at this text sometime back, you may remember it, when Saul said to his servants who stood around him, quote, "Listen here, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds?" Well, where did Saul get those fields and vineyards? That didn't come out of his personal holdings, and it very likely is that he got that additional property by driving out the Gibeonites, subjecting them to an illegal war of conquest in which he confiscates their goods and gives it to those who are serving him loyally. So you have to say Saul's motives, if that's the case, were at best pretty dubious. And even though he tried to justify his actions under what Moses had said, we see that maybe there was somewhat of a taint to his actual intent. Well, David, of course, being apprised of all of this, said to the Gibeonites, "Well, what shall I do for you? With what shall I make atonement, that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord?" So the blood of the Gibeonites screaming out from the ground. We have a concept in the Bible of innocent blood crying out from the ground for atonement, for a vindication, for a correction. It's demonstrable in history that the blood of innocents cries out from the ground. If you don't mind me saying so, I think we have some innocent blood crying out from the ground in America since 1973, and almost 70 million unborn innocents. There's going to be a day of reckoning. I don't subscribe to the philosophy behind the term karma, but it does apply here to some extent. There is a principle in the universe of a correction, a just correction of wrongdoing. The Apostle Paul said, "Don't be deceived, God is not mocked. What a man sows, he reaps. Sometimes what a man sows, his children reap." Consequences continue, even if the perpetrator is out of the picture. What Saul did was going to be reaped by subsequent generations. It's an inescapable and unavoidable fact of the DNA of the universe as God has created it. So the Gibeonites want to give David a responsible answer. What do they say? Well, we will not have silver or gold. Actually, the sense of it is we don't have any right to claim silver or gold from Saul or from his house, nor shall you kill just any man in Israel for us. So David says, okay, there's two options off the table. Whatever you say, I will do. Now, there's an interesting sort of backstory behind both of these options. Silver and gold, being paid in exchange for a life, actually flowed out of what was commonly practiced in the ancient world called lex talionis, the law of the eye. You've heard it expressed more popularly, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Moses said that. It's an intuitive sense of justice. Hammurabi said it 250 years before Moses said it. It was commonly understood in various ancient civilizations that justice requires a proportionate payback, if you will. Well, the problem was, in the ancient world, that principle of a life for a life was applied with what lawyers would call strict liability. So if you were responsible for a person's death, whether intentional or not, whether you were lying in wait or not, whether with malice aforethought or not, maybe it was just an accident. Moses used the example, an axe head flies off your axe. You didn't mean it. Negligence, and the person dies. Even then, you must pay with your life. No gradation of culpability. And so what happened in the ancient world is this practice was carried on, and the so-called avenger of blood would exact blood on behalf of the one that had died, usually a family member. You get what's called a cycle of violence. One death, followed by another death, followed by another death. Back and forth. We've seen that, of course, as recently as this morning somewhere in the world. Moses understood that, but so did other people in the ancient world. Their solution was to implement a system of compensation in which a life was given a value in money, silver and gold. And so rather than having this violent retribution back and forth, seemingly never ending, you just pay a huge amount of money and buy yourself out from under the exposure for that crime. And that was practiced, except in Israel. Moses forbid that. But Moses, and listen to me here, Moses is the first jurisprudential scholar we know of in the ancient world who actually varied from the common practice and said there should be degrees of culpability for homicide. We think of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, voluntary, involuntary manslaughter. You know all those terms. You hear them on all the crime shows on TV, don't you? Where did that come from? That was Moses. Moses said, look, if you lie in wait against a person with hatred in your heart and kill them, then Moses says, you don't take any ransom. You don't take any silver or gold. That person is exposed to capital punishment. But in the same context, he would say, if the death was unintentional, then that person can flee to a city of refuge. He can be protected there from the avenger of blood. There can be an opportunity for a trial in which due process will apply and a determination will be worked out in which what is a proper and appropriate penalty. And if it was not intentional, if it wasn't what we say murder one, then it's not going to be death. It's not going to be a life for a life. Even Moses, you see, didn't apply the same way, that law of the eye, that others did. The Gibeonites knew this. They lived for generations in Israel. And so they say, we know we have no right to ask for a hefty sum of money in exchange for the lives that were lost at the hands of Saul. Well, what about option two? Another common practice in the ancient world was human sacrifice to appease the gods. Sometimes in famine conditions or other circumstances where it seemed that the gods were angry, human sacrifice would be offered. It was a common practice in Baal worship. It was a common practice in Phoenicia and other Canaanite religions. That, of course, was an abomination in Israel, even though in Israel it was practiced occasionally in what's called the Valley of the Son of Hinnom, where there was the god Moloch. Sometimes child sacrifice was actually made, but it was repudiated in the most harsh terms, not only by Moses, but by the entire panoply of prophets and so on. Well, that was what they're alluding to here. They could have said, okay, we want you to line up 50 people, just, randomly pulled out of Israel, line them up and shoot them, and maybe that'll compensate for the losses. But again, the Gibeonites understand that's contrary to the practice, the principle, the philosophy, the law of Israel. So David, realizing, of course, the truth of both of those, says to them, okay, well then, what's it going to be? What do you say? Whatever it is, I'll do it. And at this point, he realizes they have a legitimate claim. David feels a weighty responsibility for the famine, has to figure out some way to somehow or other resolve what's going on. And so they give this answer. As for the man who consumed us and plotted against us, that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the territories of Israel, And that description suggests this was a long-standing series of rather vicious acts that would amount to something like genocide on the part of Saul, reminding us a bit of the Nazi policy, something like that. That's what the Gibeonites recalled. That's what they're now responding to in their own history. They say, let 7 men of his descendants be delivered to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord chose. And the king said, go, I will give them. So this, of course, startles us a little bit, that this is the particular way in which this issue is going to be resolved. 7 men, they could have asked for more. I'm sure they had lost more people, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands, we don't know, under the extermination policy of Saul. They asked for 7 because 7 was generally regarded as a number of completeness. So in some ways it's a modest request. They're going to hang them, literally impale them. They're going to do it before the Lord, which is a way of saying publicly. And they're going to do it in Gibeah, which was something like Saul's hometown. David says, I will give them. We sit here in the 21st century and think, what in the world is this? Is this in the Bible? How can this be? And we have this kind of reaction to it that is perfectly understandable. And again, we have to get ourselves back into the skin of the moment in time when this is happening. It doesn't resolve all the issues or the challenges, but nevertheless, I think at least helps to think about it. One commentator was musing on just what happens here. He said, quote, some have said this is just pretense by David to secure his throne. But that logic is strained and cynical, especially given his treatment of Mephibosheth. Some have said, well, David was willing to go along with this because he's just trying to make sure that no heirs to Saul are still around to threaten his claim to rule Israel. So this was a convenient way to kind of mop up, you know. But of course, as this commentator notes, that really doesn't make sense given what he does with Mephibosheth that we're going to look at eventually. He continues, at any rate, it is quite in the spirit of the times to visit upon Saul's house the sins of its chief. Israel stoned Achan with his family. You know the story of Joshua. Achan stole some forbidden goods from Jericho, brought catastrophe on Israel. When he was executed for that crime, he was executed with his wife and his children, the whole family. Seems brutal, but that's what was carried out. This commentator continues, in the Old Testament, the doctrine of collective responsibility was more prominent. And we see that on other occasions. We see in the book of Numbers a similar situation in which a guy named Gore dies with all his family. And there are other incidents of it, a kind of collective exposure for the culpability of someone who represents the group. The commentator points out, I think helpfully, Ezekiel emphasized personal responsibility. Ezekiel famously said, the soul that sins, it will die. That was actually a way of saying it's not the soul that sins, everybody belonging to that soul will also die. It was a way of narrowing the exacting of justice to the person who committed the crime. But earlier in Israel's history, there's kind of a development of a sense of jurisprudence in which you don't quite have that clarity yet. I'm just going to put it that way. And so even though we see it eventually becoming more of a prominent theme, it wasn't so much the case at the time that David was ruling. This commentator says Ezekiel emphasized personal responsibility, but the second commandment still highlighted the other principle, visited on the children to the third and fourth generations. You know that language from the second commandment. In modern jargon, we are formed by heredity and environment. Heredity was prevailing in David's day. So that's kind of the heart of the matter, and I don't know how you want to wrestle through that, but that's the way the story is given to us. The king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. So the king took Armoni and Mephibosheth, a different Mephibosheth, by the way. I wish he named him Joe, but it's Mephibosheth. The two sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, and the Maholathite. A little bit of confusion in here, but we'll try to sort out what we can. First of all, there is the former Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, and of course we know that David eventually shows him great care and provides for him lavishly in honor of his covenant that he had with Jonathan. We'll look at that story on another occasion. There's another Mephibosheth who is one of 2 sons of a woman named Rizpah. Rizpah was a concubine of Saul. She bore him 2 sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth. So these are 2 actual sons of Saul, but they would not be heirs to the throne because they are sons of a concubine, and thus I would rule them out, but they're still sons of Saul, and thus they're exposed to this. Michal is mentioned. We know elsewhere she didn't have any children. We don't know the backstory, but here it says she brought up these 5 sons. The sons here would be the sons of Merab, her older sister, and her husband, Adriel. And so something may have happened. We don't know exactly what accounts for this particular unexpected reference, but in any event, it produces 7, 2 sons, 5 grandsons, and David delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the hill before the Lord. So they fell all 7 together and were put to death in the days of the harvest, in the first days, the beginning of the barley harvest. That'd be about April, about the time of the Passover. Now Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, concubine of Saul, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock, from the beginning of harvest until the late rains poured on them from heaven. And she did not allow the birds of the air to rest on them by day, or the beasts of the field by night. Sackcloth standing for mourning, for grief. She spreads it out like a shelter against the rock where these bodies were impaled and left to decay, visibly, publicly. 2 of those were, of course, the bodies of her own sons. They're displayed for some 6 months. It's a grim reminder of Saul's earlier atrocities. She doesn't try to rescue these bodies. She just is there. And it's one of the most famous examples in all of history of someone standing vigil, not saying anything in particular, nothing to be said, but just being there as a kind of quiet testimony and witness to the tragedy of the circumstance. Eventually, the late rains poured. It's saying that the famine conditions ended, that whatever was necessary had indeed been met. Rizpah, of course, is keeping vigil over the bodies of her 2 sons and the others who died as well. She drives off birds, beasts. It's a remarkable scene. It's a scene that's so powerful that it eventually reached the attention of David. David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done. Then David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the street of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung them up after the Philistines had struck down Saul. I'm not going to remind you of that. I think you recall that particular incident where the bodies were recovered by these courageous men of Jabesh Gilead. And so those bodies are retrieved now, the remains of them, but also David gathered the bones of those who had been hanged, these 7 others. They buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son in the country of Benjamin and Zelah, in the tomb of Kish his father. So they performed all that the king commanded, and after that God heeded the prayer for the land. So the point here is that somehow the effect of the work of Rizpah, just being there, moved David so much that he went out of his way to give a very proper and public ceremony to the burial, not only of the 7, but of Jonathan and Saul, his father, as well. And that all of that was in some ways driven, you might say, by David having been moved by the story of Rizpah. And so Rizpah, I remember once some years back, we had an interim pastor here, a female, very impressive and wonderful minister who preached a whole sermon on Rizpah. I've heard one sermon in my whole life on Rizpah, and she preached it in our pulpit. And she was highlighting at that point the great value of people who simply stand vigil. May not be much to say, words may be inadequate, but just being there is the great gift you can give, and she really represents a wonderful paradigm for such a thing. One commentator, in trying to wrap up this particular account, says, quote, "This strange episode does highlight the old question, what can atone for this sin? We have a sense of needing atonement, and religions around the world are organized around the principle of indemnity. Whatever we make of this account, the underlying fact of human conscience remains, and of course, the only satisfying answer comes not through the blood of animals, let alone humans, but through the atoning work of Christ." The point here is that we can never by any act atone for sin. Whether human sacrifice or any other thing, any payment of nothing can undo the weight of guilt, the debt that is created by our sin. Only Christ's death, and that's the whole purpose of his death, is to offer the only adequate payment, the only adequate atonement. At the same time, there is in life, as we were saying earlier, a kind of principle of natural justice, and it does tend to work out with a high degree of regularity. It may take a while, but inevitably it seems that the scales of justice are finally brought equal in the circumstances of life. And so the story reminds us a little bit of both of those. And with that, I'm going to move on now to another story, which is also difficult. So, out of the frying pan into another frying pan here. David gathered all the choice men of Israel, 30,000. David, in chapter 6 of 2 Samuel, is about the task of moving the ark, the central artifact of Jewish worship, to Jerusalem. He has multiple agendas, you might say, at work here. One is certainly religious. One is certainly spiritual. He believes that there should be a place where the people will gather to worship, and he wants to make it the central sanctuary there in Jerusalem. But he has other things going on as well as a practical matter, and we don't fault him for this. David understood that to galvanize a sense of unity among the people, they needed a common vision of worship. They needed to not have a highly decentralized sort of approach where everybody sort of does his thing or her thing out in the various parts of that there needs to be somewhere where it all comes together in one script. And so as we join together in worship, we can unite in a vast number of other areas as well. Sharing together this particular aspect of our lives causes us to share other things as well. We've certainly seen in history the fact that when nations are united in a religious vision, they can tend to unite in many other ways. But when societies become increasingly polytheistic, so that everybody's marching more or less to their own ultimate drummer, the drummer that sets the agenda for their ethics more deeply than any other drummer, then sometimes it's hard for them to get along with each other. And you begin to see a kind of fragmentation of the social order based on multiple religions. And David knew that. And so David was doing what he could to not only what he believed would be to offer correct worship to God, but to also sort of consolidate his rule over these people by giving them a united vision for worship centered in Jerusalem. So many of David's psalms are written precisely to engender this sort of appreciation for Jerusalem and this sort of recognition of a central place of worship, and that the other places should be discarded. No more high places, no more worship at various places based on various views of things, that it all now needs to come together here. And so David is attempting to bring that into focus here in Israel. So he gathers people, chosen people, from all the tribes. He arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, whose name is called by the name, the Lord of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. A couple of details here require some comment. One is the phrase Baal of Judah. There was no known place in ancient Israel called Baal of Judah. The ark was actually at the home of a man named Abinadab, which was at Kirjath Jearim. And this reference to a place is therefore out of place, and it was more or less fixed by the Septuagint again. Again, we don't know exactly what was in the smoke-filled room by which they rewrote this text, but it was given in the Septuagint and largely accepted
to be something more on these lines. On the way up, David went with all the people who were with him of the fighting men of Judah, which is an alternative way of expressing that Baal Judah idea, to Kirjath Jearim to bring up from there the ark of God. And so that seems to be what's going on. It's a minor detail, but I mention it. The other thing that's a little more weighty is the literal rendering of the Hebrew here is the ark of God, that is literally the ark of Elohim, whereon is the name of Yahweh of hosts. In Hebrew, to emphasize an idea, you would repeat it. We don't do that in English. We don't translate it that way because it's not a common way of doing it in English syntax. But in Hebrew, it was quite common. And it was a way of saying that David's agenda here was to bring special focus to the particular deity who's being worshipped. It's not just an amorphous, nameless, faceless deity out there, some sort of higher power. There is a God with a name. And he dwells between the cherubim, and this is the one we worship. And there's a rather precise and narrow focus that's being suggested here by bringing the ark. The ark is the place where Yahweh rules on earth. That was the view, and that's what, in a sense, is being emphasized. So they set the ark of God on a new cart, brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which is on the hill, and Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drove the new cart. It was a nice cart. Had built-in GPS, surround sound music. It was state-of-the-art. It was brand new. You could still smell the new cart smell on it. Just how could you improve on that? The only difficulty, of course, was that it was flatly contradictory to the instructions as to how you move the ark. Moses said back in Exodus, "You shall put poles into the rings on the sides of the ark, that the ark may be carried by them," that is to say, the Kohathite priests, that branch of the Levitical priesthood charged with the duty of moving the tabernacle, the artifacts within it, including the ark. The poles shall be put in the rings of the ark, they shall not be taken from it. So there is the express direction. Already these folks, no matter how nice that ox cart was, already they're on a little bit of thin ice. Well, the ark had been at the house of Abinadab for 70 years, and now David wants to move it to his new capital in the center of Israel and use that as a place where a united vision for worship could be worked out. So they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on a hill, accompanying the ark. Ahio went before, suggesting Uzzah was behind, probably behind the ox and beside the cart. And David and all the house of Israel played music before the Lord on all kinds of instruments: firwood, harps, stringed instruments, tambourines, sistrums, and on cymbals. David wants this to be a big, wonderful celebration. He pulls out all the stops. He wants everybody to just be electrified by the wonderful moment that's taking place. So all of the great instruments of Israel, the 10-stringed harp, the tambourine, not unlike our modern tambourine, a sistrum, which was a percussion instrument that looked like that, cymbals were, of course, what you've seen before. All of these and others. We hear of trumpets and other instruments that were used. So it was quite a parade, And all of this was happening with a high degree of festivity and joy. And all the houses of Israel, all the tribes of Israel were present, represented at least, in this great moment. And then a rather dissonant incident occurs. When they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. This was apparently a known location, a permanent threshing floor. The oxen stumbled, the cart shuddered, the ark began to slide. It could slide off the cart into the dirt and be defiled. What's Uzzah to do? Uzzah labored under the mistaken impression that the most defiled thing in the presence of the ark was the dirt. It was actually Uzzah. He was the one who was defiled. And that's why he was the one who was forbidden to do what he actually did. Well, in so doing, he doesn't simply violate a general rule about how to move the ark. He violates a very precise rule about never touching the ark. So if you look at Numbers chapter 4, which covers the responsibilities of the Kohathite priests, it's their particular chapter in the book of Numbers. We read this: "When Aaron and his sons have finished covering the sanctuary and all the furnishings of the sanctuary, when the camp is set to go, then the sons of Kohath shall come to carry them, but they shall not touch any holy thing, lest they die." Uzzah certainly was aware of that. He'd been raised a Kohathite priest, probably memorized this text, which was the common religious regime at the time. But disregarding that, he reaches out, doing God a favor, steadying the ark, and we hear the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah. And God struck him there for his error, and he died there by the ark of God. The word error actually has a note in it of something like rashness. The ark was the place where Uzzah died, as if to make clear he didn't just simply die of a fortuity, an unexpected stroke or heart attack. This was God's judgment. That's the way we're supposed to understand it. Again, we're a little bit put off by this, I suppose. We think, wow, that's a little bit harsh. But again, in the Old Testament, it's not unprecedented. The two sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, heirs to be high priest in Israel, were said to offer what's called strange fire before the Lord. It sounds worse than it is. It wasn't like pig grease, you know. They thought they were improving the recipe for the incense. Every day they'd go in and refresh the incense, and they just thought, you know, if we add a little bit of cinnamon here, it'd actually be better. And so they tinker with the recipe. And they go in to offer that improved incense, and fire came out from the most holy place, and they turned into a couple of grease spots, you know. Pretty severe. Other times in the Old Testament we find that. I've heard people say, well, that's because God was especially grumpy in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, it's a little more sweetness and light. Well, not so fast. There is the case of Ananias and Sapphira. You remember them? They sold property. Nobody told them they had to sell it. They brought proceeds. They said it was all the proceeds. It was only part. Nobody said they had to bring all the proceeds. What they did that was wrong was simply tell a little white lie. They said it was all the proceeds when it was not. They kept back some to themselves, and before God and Peter they told a lie, and for that they died on the spot. I think the warning we need to take from this is that God is disposed to be merciful all the time, but we must never presume on mercy. God is also a holy God, and He's a consuming fire. And even though we bank on and love Him for the mercy He shows us, we should never be presumptive in expecting that which we could never deserve. And in some ways, stories like this, I think, give us a sobering reminder and warning against such presumptiveness. One commentator said the great lesson here is the self-sufficiency of God to see to His own things. God doesn't need our help. He requires our obedience. There's a remarkable difference. Here, the self-importance of Uzzah, together with the disregard of the rules of number 4, led to this unhappy outcome. Note that the truth of religion is to be carried on the shoulders of men and women, but that's a great insight, isn't it? The work of God is carried on the shoulders of human beings. We don't send robots to the mission field to preach the gospel. It takes human beings with skin on to do that task, because that's what God has called us to do. So the truth of religion is carried on the shoulders of men, not on technological implements. We are always those assigned that task. David asked, how can the ark come to me? He should have asked that question earlier and gotten the answer by loving God with all the heart, soul, mind, and strength, and obeying in the spirit of such love. Well, David went through some interesting emotions. First, anger. David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah. He called the name of the place Perez Uzzah to this day. Now, presumably, his anger was because he thought this was a little over the top. That all of a sudden, Uzzah's a dead body right there beside the ark. Some think, well, maybe he was angry with the priests because they didn't research this question more deeply. But the very fact that he names the place Perez Uzzah suggests that at least David's initial response was that his big party had been spoiled. This big moment, you see, when he was going to be able to galvanize the vision of all these people in worship in Jerusalem had just been sort of upended. And he felt some anger, but of course soon enough his anger turned into dread as the color faded from his face, and he asked himself, good heavens, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? And he began to realize how unworthy he was to have this holy artifact around. So, this terrifying epiphany of his leads him to a plan B. So, David would not move the ark of the Lord with him into the city of David, but David took it aside into the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. That term Gittite means he was from Gath. He was a Philistine. David wouldn't bring the ark, and it appears that at least at this point now, his anger has become a kind of superstitious fear. This ark has magic powers. I don't know that I want this thing. You know, it's kind of like Indiana Jones and the picture of the ark that you get there. It's not really a holy object. It's just kind of an undomesticated object that can really do some bad stuff to you. And so you want to be cautious with it. And that seems to be where David is now, not so sure about this. And so he drops it off with a Philistine, almost to say, oh, let's just stand back and see what happens to this guy, you know. So the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Especially impressive since he was, in fact, a Philistine. One commentator was musing on this. I thought this was interesting. How many men are there in our own day who are blessed in that by the mercy of God, their unbelieving lives are lived in a Christian context? The great postulates upon which rest the fundamental comforts and securities of our Western world are predicated upon the covenant mercies of God. The worth of the individual, the sanctity of the home, human liberty, universal education, these and many others are demonstrably an effect and influence of the Christian tradition. And others like them bless the lives of countless men and women who participate in the benefits of the Christian faith without themselves being adherents. Now, if you'd like to see that point documented much more thoroughly, I'm going to mention a book that I've mentioned before, Vishal Mangalwadi, and the book is entitled The Book That Made Your World. He grew up Hindu, became a Christian, was educated in the West, but lives in the East, and he assesses the great benefits that have flowed to Western civilization based on our possession of what he calls the book that made your world. And every point made here and much more is thoroughly defended by him in a most powerful and persuasive way. The kingdom of Christ on earth, even in its present partial triumph, demonstrates its blessings with gracious abandonment of God himself, who makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, sends his rain on the just and on the unjust. Obed-Edom was probably a believer, but stands for the benefits of God's presence, even to those who aren't. Well, David gets wind of the fact that Obed-Edom has been blessed. All that belongs to him has been given great benefit because of the ark of God. And so David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with gladness. So he's been able to modify his whole view of things to, I think, a more healthy and proper perspective. He brings it with gladness, with music. They started off walking 6 paces, as it were, testing the willingness of God to permit this parade to go on. David wrote many psalms celebrating this. The psalm that celebrates this moment is found in 1 Chronicles chapter 16, if you want to read it. I just give you the first line or two of it here. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the people, sing to him, sing psalms to him, talk of his wondrous deeds. So David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. In ancient Israel, dancing was usually the province of women. A linen ephod was usually worn by children of the priestly family. So it had to be quite a sight. I was there, snapped it right there. Here's the king of Israel dancing with a kind of reckless abandon in front of the ark as it's being brought to Jerusalem. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of trumpet. But as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and whirling before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. Probably embarrassed for him, embarrassed for her own royal status. Well, they brought the ark, set it in its place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had erected for it. David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. When he had finished the offerings, peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, blurring slightly the lines between priest and king and prophet, which was ordinarily kept quite distinct in the Old Covenant era, but in a sense anticipating, at least in a mild way, the great Messiah who would unite those offices in a fully consummated expression, prophet, priest, and king. So he distributed among all the people, among the whole multitude of Israel, both the women and the men, to everyone a loaf of bread, piece of meat, cake of raisins, so the people all went home happy and at peace. Of course, the sacrifices, some were whole burnt offerings, but most of them produced food, which, having been put through this religious ritual, this sacrificial moment, was distributed then to the people, and they were able to eat. We do the same thing, of course, in the Lord's Supper. Christ is our Paschal Lamb, and then he says, "Take, this is my body, eat it. This is my blood, drink it." And sacramentally, that's what we do. We're eating the food that had gone through this sacrifice. Israel did that, and in some ways we do it in the same way when we celebrate the Lord's Supper. Then David returned to bless his household, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How glorious was the king of Israel today, uncovering himself in the eyes of the maids of his servants, as one of the base fellows shamelessly uncovers himself." David came home full of joy. It had been a perfect day, notwithstanding the earlier mishap regarding Uzzah. He's kind of gotten a clearer vision. Everything has worked out well. He's coming home to give a special blessing to his own household, to his own servants. And the first person that confronts him as he walks in the front door is Michal, who accuses him of stripping himself, stripping his royal garments. One commentator couldn't help but see the parallel between David, who humiliated himself for the sake of worship, and the son of David, who, as Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2, didn't hang on to that glory equivalent of God himself, but took upon himself the form of a servant, humbled himself even to the point of death on the cross. And whatever David did was greatly exceeded, of course, but by the God of glory, who joined us in such a display of humiliation. Well, Michal accuses David of being base. The Hebrew word there is rakha, the same word that Jesus mentions in the Sermon on the Mount, if you recall that text. So David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore, I will play music before the Lord." The reason David says that is because Saul had done the same thing his daughter was doing, had become so preoccupied with his royal prerogative, his royal privilege, that it eventually got in the way of his sense of obedience to God himself. And David is in effect saying to Michal, you're getting perilously close to the same crime. I'm not going to go there. I will humiliate myself. I will humble myself for the sake of worship. I will realize that the only reason I'm a king and not still shepherding sheep outside of Bethlehem is because of God's grace. And I have no basis whatsoever to be inflated with a pretentious sense of being more important than I am. So he says, I'll be even more undignified than this, and I will be humble in my own sight. But as for the maidservants of whom you have spoken, by them I will be held in honor, because those who humble themselves before God will be exalted. Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Some of people have thought David punished her for the rest of her life by refusing her intimacy. That's not the sense of it, and that's not, in my opinion, the correct view, nor is it the view of most commentators. It's simply this was the sins of the fathers being visited. And again, Michal is deprived of having children, which in ancient Israel was one of the greatest and most important things that a woman could do. It was part of what went to the very heart of her worth, and thus it seems more along those lines that it's to be understood. I'm out of time, so I'm going to skip by this wonderful quote and that one too, and I'm going to come to the Sunday school lesson so we can finish pretty close to time. There's 4 people in these 2 stories who figure prominently besides David. I think we learned something from each of them. Saul teaches us that disobedience to God is never private. We sometimes hear the expression a victimless crime, and we all know what that means, but we need to understand that to be strictly biblical, there is no victimless crime. Any crime I commit, even if it seems to be purely private, is going to hit somebody somewhere. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. God would not be mocked by Saul. He won't be mocked by us. Sin's consequences are always felt by ourselves and others. Rizpah teaches us that when words fail us, we may be called to simply be there, standing in silent vigil with those for whom our words could not suffice, but our presence speaks volumes. We've all had those opportunities, and we've sometimes thought, I have to go see this person who is in such pain. What can I say? And sometimes the best thing you can say is nothing, but just to be there and join Rizpah in a kind of silent vigil that speaks the volumes to that person of grace. Uzzah teaches us that God is holy, a consuming fire, and though we rightly rejoice in God's presence, and we certainly anticipate His mercy, we should never cease to be those who are God-fearing as well, with a reverent devotion for His holy character. And finally, Michal teaches us that God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble, and that when we willingly humble ourselves in God's sight, He will exalt us in the sight of others. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Our Father, we are so grateful for the very human stories that come to us through the Scriptures. We thank you that they don't embellish the images in such a way that these people become unreal and superhuman, but that they really do present to us life as it's lived on the street. And we give you thanks that we can therefore incorporate these lessons wholeheartedly and fully with sincerity and joy, knowing that they can be truly helpful to us as they were to those who first lived the story. Thank you for this time together. Thank you for these lessons from your word. Ask your blessing on us now as we go our various ways. All of this in the name of Christ. Amen.